Start the clock. Published in 1869, Around the Moon, or Autour de la Lune, follows on from the events of Verne's earlier story From the Earth to the Moon, in which the Baltimore Gun Club built a great gun called the Columbiad to fire a manned capsule to the moon. That 1865 novel concludes with the firing of the great gun, whilst Around the Moon continues the story following our three intrepid heroes to the moon. It is some 58,000 words in length, so not long, and is the seventh novel of Jules Verne's Extraordinary Voyages series. There are three main characters, two Americans, Barbicane and Nicole, and Michel Ardan, a Frenchman. They take with them two dogs, destined to propagate the canine race on the lunar continents, to quote from the text. These are called Diana and Satellite. The plan is to land on the moon, but as you might imagine, things don't go entirely according to that plan. Consider Around the Moon to be a Victorian Apollo 8, perhaps even a Victorian Apollo 13, only more cheerful and French. One more thing before we get into it. Around the Moon is in the public domain, and many editions are probably based on questionable translations. This seems common when it comes to writers such as Verne, as you will know if you have watched my earlier video about the Nautilus. When looking for your own copy to have and hold, to treasure, be cautious in selecting your edition. There are modern translations by David Petot and Paul Walter which are recommended. Here I use the 1873 translation of Mercier and King, but it isn't the best translation and edits out a great deal of Verne's original text, especially the more technical information. Let's start with a few observations. First, the Columbiad is a space gun. There have been real-world attempts to build a space gun, such as Project Babylon and Quick Launch. The general consensus is that a space gun alone would not be sufficient to put an object into a reasonable orbit, and additional thrust from rockets would be necessary. Also, the payload would have to be robust. A human being would be out of the question. The G-forces experienced by anyone inside a capsule launched by a space gun would be fatal. One calculation has it that a passenger would experience 3 times the G-force a human body is capable of withstanding. Second observation, there are shades of the Apollo program here. It's curious that Jules Verne makes his moonshot an American venture rather than a British or French one. Remember, he was writing in the 1860s, when Britain was amazingly awesome and France was pretty good too. The Americans, meanwhile, were recovering from their Civil War. Verne also has the projectile launched from Florida, and his fictional crew is made up of 3 men. Even the addition of man's best friend makes us think of the earliest days of the Soviet space program. Third observation, Jules Verne's vision of the moon runs counter to the expectations of his characters. In chapter 3 he writes, "As to water and the reserve of brandy, which consisted of 50 gallons, there was only enough for 2 months. But according to the last observations of astronomers, the moon had a low, dense and thick atmosphere, at least in the deep valleys, and there springs and streams could not fail. Thus, during their passage, and for the first year of their settlement on the lunar continent, these adventurous explorers would suffer neither hunger nor thirst." Once in lunar orbit, however, we get a rather different moon. Unlike H.G. Wells' own The First Men in the Moon, in Verne's tale, the moon is decidedly barren and without life. But the intrepid adventurers do glimpse an active volcano. Another observation is the distinct lack of weightlessness. The gravity of Earth apparently sustains our heroes until they move past the point between the Earth and the Moon where the gravity of both cancel each other out. And only then do Barbicane, Nicole and Ardan experience weightlessness. It would seem the idea of weightlessness even in Earth orbit had yet to be fully recognized. The story of Around the Moon goes like this. The president of the Baltimore Gun Club, Impey Barbicane, and his rival, Captain Nicole, board the projectile car with Michel Ardan, a French adventurer and poet. The gun is fired, and the initial shock knocks our intrepid heroes out cold. Once they have recovered, they find they are indeed in space and are very nearly hit by an Earth-orbiting meteorite. Phew, it's a close one. But unbeknownst to them, the close call with the meteorite has pushed their projectile car slightly off course. Meanwhile, they find the dog's satellite has cracked his skull during launch and is in a piteous state. Poor dog. Nicole and Barbicane engage in calculations and realize the projectile car hasn't enough velocity to reach the moon, not even halfway. Our heroes are thrown into a momentary crisis, but then discover their craft is still travelling moonwards, and so they relax. At which point they find the poor unfortunate satellite has died. Poor dog. This though creates a problem. How do you dump the body, which they solve by tossing it quickly out of a window? Yes, they can do that. God knows what they do when they need the toilet. Verne doesn't say. Perhaps they open a window and stick their posterior outside. Anyway, to the surprise of our heroes, the body of satellite remains outside and accompanies them on their flight moonwards. Closer and closer they get to the moon. Verne writes, "Here and there they fancied they saw vast seas, scarcely kept together under so rarefied an atmosphere, and watercourses emptying the mountain tributaries. Leaning over the abyss, they hoped to catch some sounds from that orb forever mute in the solitude of space." As they get closer, they become strangely intoxicated and behave in a bizarre fashion. What's happening? Has Satellite the dog cursed them? Is this some Ivan Vasily weirdness? No, the answer lies elsewhere. Nicole realizes that too much oxygen has filled the car. The valves are turned down and the spacecraft returns to normal. Or as normal as they can get with Michel Ardan on board, who, it is now discovered, has smuggled aboard 6 live chickens and a cockerel. How very French. The projectile car starts to experience a loss of gravity. Various items, including the surviving dog Diana, start floating about. Michel Ardan exclaims,
"Ah, that is rather an amusing piece of natural philosophy."
Sorry, people of France. But only now does it become apparent that there is a bigger problem. No, not my dreadful French accent. The projectile car is off course and will miss the moon. The cause? The meteorite they encountered earlier, of course. Instead of landing on the moon, they will fall into an orbit. It seems the intrepid adventurers are to orbit the moon for eternity, or seemingly will become trapped at the Lagrangian point, or dead point, where the gravitational pull of the Earth is equal to the gravitational pull of the moon. Our heroes are cool and calm about it, and they closely observe the surface. And here we get a host of mid-19th century lunar descriptions. But then our intrepid heroes remember the rockets which were meant to arrest the projectile car's descent. In an attempt to push their spacecraft towards the moon, so to effect a landing, they fire the rockets. But instead of falling towards the moon, they fall towards the Earth. We now cut to the USS Susquehanna, which incidentally was a real ship, a paddle-wheel steam frigate launched in 1850 and decommissioned in early 1868. In the novel, she is engaged in a survey for the laying of a submarine telegraph cable. Her crew's work is rather rudely interrupted by the fiery plunge of the projectile car as it crashes into the Pacific Ocean. A rescue operation swings into action, using a diving bell, rather unlikely given the crushing pressure and steam-powered grappling claws. The projectile car is believed to have sunk down to a depth of 20,000 feet, or 6,096 meters. And unsurprisingly, the would-be rescuers find nothing. They give it up for a bad job and start for home. But wait, what is that strange boy floating in the sea? Why is the projectile car bobbing on the surface? And inside we find our intrepid astronauts enjoying a game of dominoes. And that, my friends, is Around the Moon by Jules Verne. Stop the clock.